4-hour, quote, general holiday to protest Goodwin's killing. We have the first citywide general strike in Canada's history. Many industries were shut down, including the streetcars, the docks, the longshore workers walked out, construction workers walked out, and service sector workers walked out. The civic and business leaders in Vancouver were outraged, and there was a whole bunch of episodes of vigilantism during this strike. Here's a photograph of today the 411 Senior Centre on Homer Street. At the time it was the Vancouver Labour Temple, and a crowd of 300 war veterans who had been riled up by businessmen in Vancouver marched on this building, demanding that they see the Labour Council's secretary, Vic Midgley. Eventually, the veterans got a hold of him. They pulled him down onto the street, forced him to kiss the Union Jack, and then beat him. The Labour Council's telephone operator was also beaten at this time, Mrs. Frances Foxcroft. So this was only the most high-profile Labour protest in the summer of 1918, but unrest erupted from coast to coast. In Quebec, the local registrar's office, so the office responsible for conscription, was burnt to the ground, and the Borden government responded by deploying 4,000 troops to Quebec. 5 civilians were killed in the fighting. At the town of Black Lake, south of Quebec City, a farmer shot a Dominion policeman while resisting the draft. In Toronto, there was a large riot of veterans, prompting the military command to deploy troops. So there was social unrest erupting in all cities in Canada, and this was right at the very end of the war. And it also coincided with the largest number of Allied losses, or of Canadian deaths, on the Western Front. In September 1918, 2,800 Canadians died in Europe. The next month, which was the very last month of the war, 3,000 Canadians died in the trenches of France and Flanders. So the war ended in Europe as class war was erupting in Canada. And the fears of Canada's ruling class were very clear in a number of government decisions. This is a list of organizations that were banned by a list of publications, so newspapers, pamphlets, periodicals that were banned by the Canadian government at the end of the First World War. At the very top was the Victoria Labour Council's newspaper called The Week. It included other publications called A Reply to the Press Lies Concerning the Russian Situation. Other publications, The Canadian Forward, a publication in Russian called Rabochny Narod, published in Winnipeg, and a whole number of left-wing and socialist publications. So alongside the banning of these newspapers, a number of groups were banned. And these included the Industrial Workers of the World, the Social Democratic Party, and a whole number of Russian, Finnish, and Ukrainian radical and working class organizations, and also 2 Chinese organizations, the Chinese Nationalist League and the Chinese Labor Association. So the war ended in Europe as the government of Canada declared war on radical labor. 1 month before the armistice ended fighting on the Western Front, most labor strikes in Canada were banned in an order in council passed by the federal government. And this happened right when Calgary workers went on strike, freight handlers who moved goods. And there was talk of a sympathy strike to support them. This order in council included what was called a work or fight clause, which allowed the government of Canada to conscript strikers into the armed forces.
One of the federal categories on nowpolling.ca is military. When you click on this topic, 2 subtopics appear. The first one is about Canada's affiliation with NATO and NORAD.
Here you have the choice of agreeing and voting for one of the submitted statements.
Or you can introduce your own opinion on whether our affiliation with NATO and NORAD is working for peace or perpetuating war.
The second subtopic on military questions its mission or the reasons for the military to continue to exist. as we know it.
If you have registered yourself on nowpolling.ca, you can participate on this important poll by either agreeing with one of the statements already suggested, or you can add your own new choice. And that is what perpetual direct democracy is all about.
So now we are going to look briefly at the Russian Revolution and the Allied intervention, because this had a major role in provoking Canada's labour revolt, and it has been virtually left out of the history books, even by labour historians. Here's a map of Russia. The borders of Russia have always changed in history, but it shows you it's not oriented north-south perfectly, but basically, the sketch of Allied intervention saw Canadian soldiers sent to 4 fronts encircling Russia. And it was a part of an Allied strategy that included 14 countries designed to bring about a change in government by defeating the Bolsheviks and putting either monarchists or other leaders who were sympathetic to Western interests in power. The first front, or one of the 4 fronts, was in the north, very close to the border with Finland. And 600 Canadians sailed from Scotland as part of what was called the Siren Party to the port of Murmansk on the White Sea. There's Murmansk. The second front was the Arkhangelsk front at the port of Arkhangelsk, which wasn't that far from Murmansk. And the Elope Party included 500 Canadians who also sailed from the British Isles. Now the third front was on a completely different side of Russia. And these soldiers entered the former Russian Empire from Iraq, from Baghdad, attached to British troops. And they were called the Dunster Force, named after the British commander. And they traveled from Baghdad up into what's now Azerbaijan to the port of Baku on the oil-rich shores of the Caspian Sea. And there was a whole other front that involved by far the largest number of Canadians, and it was over at Vladivostok, 50 kilometers from China, 80 kilometers from North Korea, the Siberian Expeditionary Force, which included 4,200 Canadian troops who landed at Vladivostok. So this strategy was designed to encircle the Soviet Union. At the time, the Bolsheviks controlled just a small territory from St. Petersburg, including Moscow, and running up to the Ural Mountains, where the active front between the Reds and the Whites was taking place. And the idea of this Siberian force was that Canadian troops would travel along the Trans-Siberian Railroad all the way to the Ural front to help the effort to defeat the Red Army and drive right through to Moscow. Well, in the end, this strategy failed. The soldiers traveled, and to bring it back to the home front, the soldiers left for Vladivostok from the west coast, from Vancouver and from Victoria. There was over 4,000 of them. 1/3 of them were conscripted soldiers. And they traveled by train from Nova Scotia, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and they trained at camps in New Westminster, in Coquitlam, and in Victoria. And they were still training when the war ended in Europe. So you had this bizarre phenomenon that this war was ending in Europe, and yet there were a whole new army was being mobilized to BC to start a whole new war in a whole new theater of war in the Russian Far East, in Vladivostok. So you have the war ending over here on the Western Front as Canada is sending soldiers around the world to launch a war against the Bolsheviks from Siberia. And this didn't sit well with the local labor movement. And just one example of the views of labor in BC at the time are shown by this statement from Joe Naylor, who you can see hopefully on the screen there, president of the BC Federation of Labor and a close friend of Ginger Goodwin, who said shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, quote, "Is it not high time that the workers of the Western world take action similar to that of the Russian Bolsheviki and dispose of their masters as those brave Russians are now doing?" So Naylor and others like him, Naylor, who was the top officer in BC's labor movement, called for the workers in the Western world, including Canada, to dispose of their masters as the Bolsheviks had done. Bolshevism inspired workers across the world. And before there were splits over the Russian Revolution, there was a widespread unity among the Canadian working class that said, hands off Russia. And meetings to this effect took place in every Canadian city. The labor councils of the 4 largest cities in Canada went on record opposing Canada's intervention in Russia. So the labor councils of Vancouver, Winnipeg, Toronto, and Montreal. And farmer organizations also opposed Canada's intervention in Siberia and on the other fronts. The United Farmers of Ontario was one farmer organization that opposed this campaign. And even sections of the business community opposed the Canadian intervention in Russia. The Toronto Globe newspaper, which became the Globe and Mail, was on record opposing the Siberian expedition, along with other newspapers. In Victoria, the labor movement had a very direct motivation for its campaign because you had 3,000 soldiers preparing to sail to Vladivostok. So there were meetings held in big theaters and meeting halls in Victoria where hundreds and hundreds of soldiers came to meetings. There was one meeting where 700 soldiers, so about 1/4 of the force, came to a meeting where labor speakers were saying, hands off Russia. So the outcome of this agitation was a mutiny in the streets of Victoria on December the 21st, 1918, 6 weeks after the armistice. And here's a description of how the military command responded when 2 companies of French-Canadian troops refused to march to the ship. And this happened at the corner of Fort Street and Quadra Street in Victoria. So this is from a lieutenant's letter to his wife describing the Victoria Mutiny. Quote, "The other 2 companies from Ontario were ordered to take off their belts and whip the poor devils into line. And they did it with a will, and we proceeded. This company continued the march virtually at the point of the bayonet, they being far more closely guarded than any group of German prisoners I ever saw." So you had 2 companies, about 300 French-Canadian soldiers, who were marched at bayonet point onto a ship to sail for Vladivostok. And what happened to them is a totally different presentation, and the subject of a forthcoming book, so you'll have to look into it yourselves. But the ringleaders were detained in the ship's hold, shackled together. For 35 days, they were prevented from bathing until they were court-martialed and sentenced to, well, the biggest sentences was 3 years of hard labor. In the end, these sentences were commuted because it turned out it had been illegal for the government to send conscripts to Russia. But to make a long story short, there was widespread unrest across the country. Labor, farmers, and the whole province of Quebec outraged over this Siberian expedition and Canada starting a whole new war right when the war had ended in Europe. And so reluctantly, the Canadian government decided to withdraw the troops. They sailed at the end of 1918. They arrived in the end of 1918. They arrived in January 1919. But by the spring of 1919, the Canadians were brought home. And they returned to a country divided along the lines of social class. Canada had been defeated in Siberia, and that's the reason why this history was completely forgotten. The goal was to wipe out the Soviet Union at its inception, but the Soviet Union held on for the next 7 decades. So to bring the thing back to the home front and move towards our discussion. Canada was divided. The RCMP wasn't yet created, but its precursor, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, was originally confined to Saskatchewan and Alberta, the Northwest Territories, at the time, before those provinces were carved out. Well, right in the midst of this labor agitation, as the mutiny was breaking out in Victoria and labor across BC was railing against the Siberian expedition, the federal government extended the jurisdiction of the Mounties into BC and opened the first detachment in Vancouver and another one in Esquimalt, the Navy base in Victoria. And police spies at the time, if you read through the letters, they talked about a, quote, revolutionary plot in Vancouver to steal ammunition and dynamite from local military depots. They talked about arms that were waiting on the wharf for shipment to Siberia going missing, and feared that these had fallen into the hands of revolutionaries. So this was the climate at the time. Some longshoremen, like J.S. Wordsworth, a former Methodist minister, refused to load arms onto a ship going to Vladivostok. And in this climate, oh, there's a shot of the Canadians in Vladivostok. The lieutenant governor of BC asked for 2 warships from Britain to maintain order on the west coast. And here's the quote. I urge upon, and this is the lieutenant governor of BC, who was a shipping tycoon named Frank Bernard. He said, I urge upon the imperial government the importance of keeping a few large cruisers on this coast, if for no other reason than for that of having a force to quell any rising on the part of the IWW. The personnel of such a force would not be subjected to the insidious socialistic propaganda which reaches the soldier. In other words, would be more amenable to discipline and not affected by local influences. In the event of labor strikes, with demonstrations leading to riots, a serious situation would arise if the soldiers were in sympathy with the strikers. So the Queen's representative in BC called for 2 British warships to put down labor unrest in BC. In the end, these ships never arrived. The Prime Minister, who was in London at the time, responded that since 1885, we have attended to our own rebellions, talking about the suppression of the Second Métis Rebellion, the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. So the enemy had clearly shifted. It was no longer Germany or Hun aggression, as it was called in the newspapers. The enemy was radical labor. And in 1921, J.S. Wordsworth, jailed during the Winnipeg strike, the former longshoreman who had refused to load arms for Siberia, was elected to the House of Commons, part of a 2-member labor caucus that included a Calgary journalist named William Irvine. In that election, the Conservative government, which had overseen the war effort, was hugely defeated, falling to 3rd place. And it was one of the most unpopular governments in Canadian history up to that time. So this electoral change, in the aftermath of Canada's labor revolt, laid the foundation for the social democratic political tradition. So that's it. I've talked a lot, but just 2 sentences that sum up what I saw happening. The First World War shook Canada to its roots, and it left it a different country. The war sharpened the divide between workers, employers, and the state, and it created